One of you in the comments actually requested like a review of A Course in Miracles, and this was a few weeks ago, and I thought about it for a while, and at first I was like, I don't really know if, like, I don't know how to review it. I don't know if I'm qualified to review it, but then when I realized that maybe it could be helpful for me just to tell you my story of how A Course in Miracles has impacted my life, then I realized I would be really happy to do that. So that's what this video is dedicated to. This is for anybody who might be curious about A Course in Miracles. I will start by saying, and the Course itself says this, that this is just one way to help us each understand the way. So it's not the only way to understand the like laws of the universe, the nature of God, or what I like to call now Mother God, but it is one helpful way. And I will say too that just because I believe there's a lot of truth in this text, it is important to realize that anything, even if it is rooted in truth, can be used by people who don't have who have malintent to manipulate. So just because maybe a group is focused on A Course in Miracles doesn't necessarily mean you want to wholeheartedly like just trust that group. So a course itself, or a lot of people call A Course in Miracles the Course, and sometimes I'll probably use that language. So the Course itself will say things like that. Like it's not a text intended to replace religion. This is essentially a self-study course. It can be very helpful to come into groups and study it together, but you just want to make sure that you're always coming back to your own guidance, your own discernment. And you might find by coming back to your own guidance and your own discernment that A Course in Miracles isn't the right or the most helpful like resource for you in your spiritual journey. So with all that being said, I am going to give you just like the messy, word vomited version of my journey with A Course in Miracles, in hopes that if you are curious about it, it can maybe answer some questions, so on and so forth. And if there's anything you want to share, any questions that you have, please don't hesitate to put them in the comments. This might be the only video I do on A Course in Miracles, or if there are more questions, I'm certainly willing to continue to tell you about my experience. So the big preface over this entire video is just, this is my personal experience with A Course in Miracles, and everybody's going to have their own experience with it. So with that said, A Course in Miracles has been a life-changing text in my life. It came to me in my early 20s. And so at this point, it's been a part of my life. I've been quote unquote studying it, you could say, with different intensities, different seasons of intensities for, over a decade and a half now. And I originally found it because I read Marianne Williamson's book, A Return to Love, which is a really beautiful book. I'd highly recommend it if you're interested in A Course in Miracles. That book is based on Marianne's experience of A Course in Miracles. So I first read that book, and prior to that, like in college, I was, reading a lot of like new age spirituality books. So I was definitely seeking. And once I found Marianne's book and it was based on A Course in Miracles, I thought I should really, and at that point I had heard it referenced in all these different books multiple times, but I had never read it. And so I thought, I'm going to see what A Course in Miracles is about. So I ended up checking it out from the library, and I read the first like 150 pages. And I remember not really understanding anything that it was saying. Like it didn't make sense to me, but I enjoyed reading it, and I felt good when I read it, and I felt like there was truth in it, even though I didn't understand it, which sounds bizarre. I know it's like weird to put words to it, but that's really how I felt. And I think that's partly because, one way that I would describe A Course in Miracles to people is it's helping us unlearn the distortions and dysfunctions that our cultures and subcultures have taught us. Okay. And so sometimes when we're in the process of unlearning that, it's like we don't even have, like, our brain, our neural pathways can't even process this new way, but we can feel like, wait, there seems to be some truth to this new way of thinking. And I keep saying way, and I'm like catching that because I, so I do morning pages quite often, which comes from Julia Cameron's work, The Artist Way. And simply but powerfully, you just like write out whatever you're thinking, like 3 pages, just to like get it out. It's been a life-changing practice for me. And one thing that came out recently in my morning pages was like the way of the way, getting curious about the way of the way. And the way being like, what is the nature of existence? What is the nature of the universe? What is the nature of God, or what I like to call Mother God now? The way of the way. And so in this morning pages, essentially in this dialogue with myself, I was just like, the way of the way is very different than the ways we were taught by our culture, especially if you're tuning in as somebody who is conditioned in the Western culture, right? The way of the way is very different. And by saying the way of the way, I also want to just say, like, I mean that in terms of principles. So I believe each of us is this innately, uniquely creative being. And the specifics of how we live out and experience the principles of the way are all going to be so different, right? But I also think there are principles. Like, the universe is not just a chaotic mess. There are laws of the universe, and there are principles, and Mother God is principled. Do you know what I mean? Like she's not going to and actually I'll get to that when we talk about the introduction to A Course in Miracles. But my point is, so the way of the way is going to look so different in each of us as we're all following our unique path, right? But the principles of the way can be understood in different ways. And that's what A Course in Miracles, says. Like, it's like one way to help you understand the principles of the way. It's one way to understand the principles of the way. It's a helpful tool and resource for some people to understand the way of the way, right? And I think it's helpful to understand that the way of the way is very, very different than the way of our current conventional culture, right? And even in A Course in Miracles, I think it's in one of the workbook lessons, it says something like that, like this way is not, I'm just paraphrasing using my own words, but like, this way is not difficult, it's just different. And so I think when I was that first initial reading of A Course in Miracles, where I checked it out from the library, I read the first 150 pages, I felt a resonance, but I could not consciously understand it. I think it was that dissonance that I was in, like, wait, I really thought I understood life. I was very kind of hook, line, and sinker with the conventional way of living, and it was like, quote unquote, working for me in terms of like, I was a successful teacher and, so on and so forth. And but I was deeply unhappy and deeply anxious, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And so, when when it was like 3 weeks or whatever, the library, when you check books out from the library, when it was due, I brought it back, because even though I had read a significant amount, I had, it resonated with it, I just did not understand it. However, there was a book club at this library, and I had never gone before, and I never went after this one time that I went, and the only time I went is because they were discussing a New Age book by Eckhart Tolle. I believe it was like maybe The Power of Now or something. And so I went, and there just happened to be, coincidentally or synchronistically, a woman there who was a part of a study group who met once a week that discussed A Course in Miracles. And I think A Course in Miracles had to have come up in the conversation or something like that, because I was talking with her afterwards, and she invited me to the study group. And it was through that study group that I began to really understand it. And so this is where, like, it can be helpful to come into groups around A Course in Miracles. You just want to make sure that there's a lot of health in those groups, so that the the principles of A Course in Miracles aren't twisted in a manipulative way, because they certainly can be in the wrong hands. I was fortunate enough that this group was a totally free group, and it was run by an older gentleman who still just has like this like really soft spot in my heart. He's just a beautiful soul. And his day job for decades was he was a therapist in a addiction recovery center, and so he had a lot of deep understanding of trauma, a deep understanding of the human condition, knowledge of psychology, and so he facilitated the group, and he was just a really beautiful facilitator for what I needed at the time, and so I feel very fortunate that that year I went weekly, and that was my main introduction to A Course in Miracles. Now, as I say that, I sincerely believe that, like as deeply cliche as it sounds, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. So whether you feel curious about A Course in Miracles and you're ready for this particular resource, or it's a different resource on your spiritual journey, I have no doubt that you will find something. I don't think you have to have this specific group or be lucky to be able to understand this. I know you will find the resources you need to help bring some context around these principles so that you can internalize it more and more clearly. For me, that was the main resource that I needed. And so I went to this group. I started doing the workbook. I believe during that process, not in the group, but just on my own, I read through the entire text. So if you see here, if I open to the table of context, there's a significant part of this is the text, and then there's also a workbook, and then there are different like appendages. I don't know, is that what you call them? Like additions. So like we have Manual for Teachers as an addition. Here we've got like supplements, so it talks about psychotherapy. We got the Song of Prayer. So during that first year, I went weekly to the study group. I loved it, and I read through the entire text. It wasn't until about a year in that I feel like the practice of the text absolutely changed the trajectory of my life. So I'll share this story with you because it was really the first time I viscerally experienced a miracle in the way A Course in Miracles like defines miracle, which essentially A Course in Miracles defines miracle as a shift in perspective. And then that shift in perspective opened up an entirely new trajectory for myself and my husband, and literally changed my life. And so, and then that's been the experience in bigger and more subtle ways throughout the last decade and a half of this idea of a miracle being a shift in perspective. So the story goes that I had been studying the course for about a year. At that time in my life, personally, my husband and I were both public school teachers, and my husband had lost his job, and my time had been cut at the job I was at. So I was really worried about money. I was really worried about our jobs. And I had just had an interview the week. So I think I had an interview on like Monday, and this was like a Wednesday study group. And it was for a full-time job. And I had absolutely convinced myself that I absolutely needed this job. There was no other way that we were going to be okay unless I had this one particular job in the whole face of, on the whole planet and the whole universe. I knew exactly what I needed, and we had needed this one particular job. And it just so happened, coincidentally or synchronistically, that the topic of conversation that evening was this mantra from A Course in Miracles, which is, I'm willing to see things differently. And just to give you context for the group, what we did, we didn't like come up with topics ahead of time. We just literally read through the text together. So if we stopped here, one Wednesday before, we would start up here. So it just so happened that within the text, we were on this concept of I'm willing to see things differently. And I have this like very visceral memory of being in the like corner of this like L-shaped couch, Typically there was anywhere from like 5 to 12 people in this study group, just in this man's living room. And we were talking about this concept of I'm willing to see things differently. And, I was participating in the conversation. Like I was acting like, oh yeah. I was acting spiritual, but inside my body, inside my mind, I was like overcome with anxiety. I was like ramping myself up to a panic attack. Because it was like, as we're talking about this idea of being willing to see things differently, I was doubling down that like, but no, in this particular case, Mama God, I didn't call her Mama God at that point, but in this particular case, like I'm right. And I need my life to go this way to be okay. So there was like this juxtaposition happening, and it was like causing quite literally, I was on the verge of a panic attack. And I was like not willing to actually see things differently. So it like ramped up and ramped up and ramped up, and nobody else knew. Like I was pretty practiced at keeping my anxiety under wraps at that point. But I remember walking out to the car, and I was so anxious. I finally was like, fine, I am willing to see things differently. Like I was mad at God. And, but as soon as I said it and I meant it, there was just this like that wave of relief came over me. And I got in my car and I drove home, which was like a 20 to 30 minute drive. And, I was relieved. I was happy. And suddenly about like 10 minutes into the drive, I was like, this like idea felt like it just popped into my mind. And it was like, what if we went and taught overseas next year instead of trying to find a job where we were at? And I got really excited about it. When I got home, I talked to my husband about it. He was really excited about it as well. Then the next day, that night I had this dream that we were teaching in some place like tropical. The next day, literally, I found a recruiting agency that recruited English-speaking teachers and to different countries around the world. And then literally within 1 week, we had interviewed with this recruiting agency, got accepted. And it was like maybe 2 weeks we were placed in schools. So we ended up being placed in public schools in Taiwan, being conversational English teachers. And I'm not kidding you. It was like between 6 to 8 weeks, no more than 8 weeks from me having that idea that we were living and working in Taiwan. 6 to 8 weeks. And that experience of living and working in a culture completely different than mine, or than ours, I should say, because both my husband and I went, was absolutely life-changing. Because it was almost like putting A Course in Miracles into, like we got to experience it to a certain extent. Because essentially this is telling us like the culture of the way, the culture of Mother God, right? A Course in Miracles is. But we have this other culture going on. Again, we've got the culture of like the overall Western culture. We've got all the different subcultures we're a part of, whether it's, our communities, religious groups, so on and so forth. We have our family cultures, we have our friend group cultures, right? And a lot of times those principles are very different than the principles of the way. And so what I got to experience experiencing the Taiwanese/Chinese culture is like, wow. I mean, it was culture shock, right? But in that, and I'm not saying the Taiwanese culture and the Chinese culture, is more aligned or less aligned with the way. The point is more just like I got to see the culture shock was eye-opening in a visceral way. And I got to really internalize like we're making this all up. So wouldn't it be beneficial for me to understand principles that actually work, principles that are actually healthy, and then align my life with that, instead of giving my power away to arbitrary culture? Now, as I say that, that's much easier said than done, right? And a part of my journey has been realizing, like learning a lot about trauma, learning a lot about attachment theory, learning a lot about complex PTSD. So I don't just hone in on A Course in Miracles and have that be my only healing practice, spiritual practice, because I think it's been helpful for me to have a myriad, a mosaic of things, because what I learned from, the more trauma-informed, trauma-aware work is that culture is huge, because we are all innately wired to want to and need to, it's not even a want, it's a need to belong. It's a part of our survival. And so if we don't realize how much we can often unconsciously give up for that need, it can be it's wise for us to realize that we do unconsciously give up a lot, and that we have to slowly heal and slowly bring things to consciousness in order to be able to stand more and more in alignment with the principles that we consciously choose, right? But back, 15 years ago in my early 20s, going to Taiwan helped me see two different cultures in action, and they're very different cultures, right? And so it was the first time I experienced just the power of culture. And first time I had some space to realize, like, maybe I get to choose here. And so that was incredibly powerful for many, many different reasons. After we had that experience and came back to the States, so on and so forth, A Course in Miracles was still a major part of my life, I would say, for about like 5 years. And I would say during that 5 years, I mean, that's kind of arbitrary, but hopefully there was like a season of a few years, 3 to 5 years, where I was deeply invested in active study of A Course. At that time, though, I never finished the workbook. So I always went to so there's 365 lessons in the workbook. I always went to maybe 200, and I just never finished it. And so there was like something happening within me where this was helping me theoretically change my perspectives, but I was still having a hard time internalizing them. And what does this mean for actually also being a human who has to live their life? And so there was a period of time where I took a break from studying A Course of Miracles. So I feel like I never disavowed, what's the word? Disavowed? Or I don't know the word, but the principles also made sense to me. I just was but also I have to figure out what the hell is my career, and what the hell is money, and what the hell, how do you human? And so during that time, I think I did more of that. And then it was about, I don't know, again, there's just seasons. So maybe 5 to 8 years ago, where I started to come back to A Course in Miracles. And I felt like it was more from how do I integrate all this now? So I went from being super seduced by conventional culture, which is basically kind of all give your power away, make sure external things look good without being okay internally, right? Then I swung to the other side and was super interested in the theory of A Course in Miracles, and did have some practical, I already explained, when the first big quote unquote miracle experience where I was I'm willing to see this differently. I went from being convinced I knew better than God and needed one particular job to having a completely different understanding and going a different route. So I did experience in my life, but it was more theoretical, like I already said. Then I went in the season of just more nitty gritty humaning. What do I want for my human life? And then again, 5 to 8 years ago, I started to come back gently to A Course in Miracles. And at some point during that time, my husband and I studied it more together. So because I became really curious about why I had never finished the workbook. And he had always, he had read bits and pieces of A Course in Miracles. He had never been quite as invested in it as I had. But when I started to express to him, I think there's something, why haven't I finished the workbook? And I asked him if he wanted to do it with me. Then we both, for a few years, really invested in it together. And so during that time, I think it took maybe 18 months to 2 years, we read through the entire text, just one lesson or one chapter or section, a day, 1 or 2 a day. And then we did the entire workbook. And through that, it was really, again, it was helpful to come more in communion and connection with somebody to talk about it a little bit. He also read it out loud to me, which was, it was just nice to hear it. The text itself uses words that feel deeply religious and deeply Christian. And the pronouns are all masculine. Okay. And ultimately from what I've read about that, that's really, that was intentional. Okay, so there's a few things I need to get into. So we didn't talk about this, but A Course in Miracles is said is to be channeled by a woman. And she claims the entity, quote unquote, that she was channeling was Jesus Christ. Now, if that freaks you out, that makes sense. Because I think sometimes the idea of channeling can be used in a really positive sense, where it's like we are allowing higher wisdom to come through, right? And sometimes people can use it in a very like manipulative, creepy, weird way, right? So I always look at like, regardless of the story of how this came to be, when it comes to like channeled work, I would just ask myself, like, is the information helpful, right? For me, A Course in Miracles has been super consistent in its principles and incredibly helpful in my life. So I think you really don't have to believe in channeling. You don't have to believe it comes from Jesus Christ to get value out of it. I think it's important to realize that the lingo that was used, the traditional words that was used, were used to, from my understandings back in like the 60s or 70s, whenever this was channeled, to help like use the same language that most people in the Western culture were used to using around spirituality, and then help mold the understanding of what true spiritual principles are. Do you see how it's kind of like it's moldable, and it's moldable isn't the right word, because it's certainly not moldable. There are very clear, cohesive principles that are laid out, but it's like with those clear, cohesive principles staying the same, because I am changing, I'm interpreting them differently, and my practice around the Course is changing too. Do you know what I mean? And so I think that's important to realize that, like, you're likely, if this is a helpful text for you, if this is a helpful resource for you in understanding spirituality more, you're likely going to have seasons with it. And I think it's important to allow those seasons naturally to unfold, because it's been my experience that with each season I've had with A Course in Miracles, it does unlock deeper and deeper understandings. And I'll also say, as I already alluded to, I think it's important to realize that like it doesn't have to be your only thing. You know what I mean? You can. I think what I've loved, and as I'm like speaking this out loud, is like funny that I'm saying this because this channel is called Discern Through Divination, right? Discernment is really important to me. But I think where I first really learned it or started to learn discernment was through A Course in Miracles, because it gave me principles to really think about things through. And it taught me that discernment was important versus teaching me to like sacrifice my discernment to some sort of dogma. Does that make sense? And so I found actually that with A Course in Miracles as like a foundational, important resource in my life, I can open myself up to many, many, many other resources that help me understand life and spirituality in a way, in all these different nuanced ways, because I have greater and greater discernment. So I am able to more and more sense like, ooh, is this on point or is this off point? Or even if it is on point, is it the right resource for me at the time? Is it not the right resource? And so I think that's a huge something I'm so grateful for from what has come from being a student of A Course in Miracles, is that I have grown in my discernment, which kind of like paradoxically, like as you have more sturdy principles and discernment, it opens you up because you don't have to be so scared of all that's out there, because you're like, I can sort through this for myself. Me and Mother God can figure this out. Me and my higher self can figure this out, figure out what's right for me, so on and so forth. And so it really has been an incredibly powerful tool, resource in my life. I think, again, if you have any further questions about it that you feel would be helpful that I speak on, I'm really happy to do it, because it has been it's been life-changing in my world. It is not my only thing I go to. It is not my only, it has allowed diversity, I guess is what I'm trying to say, because it's has been one thing that has given me a strong foundation for how to navigate all the things that are thrown at us in this world, both in just like our conventional human life, but then also in this world of spirituality. So with all that said, if you're still with me, wow, thank you for tuning in. It feels like really, I feel really grateful that somebody might be interested in my journey with A Course in Miracles, because I've never thought about like really speaking it out in this way. But what I guess what I want to leave you with is the introduction to A Course in Miracles, because this is what really got me. Because I think there's just such, got me not like hooked in like a gross way, but like, oh, that feels like truth. That feels like there's something cohesive about that. And that is also something that has stuck with me. That is a reason I stick with A Course in Miracles, is because there's a cohesiveness. There isn't hypocrisy. There isn't like, well, but you said that here and you said that here. There isn't like, well, but how do I interpret that, or how do I do that in this world, in my like actual life? There can be times where it takes a lot of courage to put these things into practice in our actual life, because this way, the way of the way, is different than the way of our culture. But it's never like, whoa, this philosophy is so narrow-minded that I can't fit this reality of life into it. Do you know what I mean? So I appreciate it, and that's something that's helped me in my discernment of other, ways of describing the way, of understanding the way, is that like, if it's so narrow and specific that I can't fit what's actually happening in the world and my life into it, then instead of demonizing myself or the world, I might need to find something that is broader. Because I think Mother God can fit realities. Like, she's not narrow-minded, right? And so I think it's important that the ways that we understand the nature of the universe also can hold the realities of our life experience. So that's what I found with A Course in Miracles. And let's end here by reading an introduction to The Course in Miracles. We'll maybe talk about it just a bit. It's really, or I'll speak for myself. I've found it, every time I read it, I find it to be quite powerful. And it certainly was, again, what got me super intrigued at the beginning. It goes like this. This is A Course in Miracles. It is a required course. Only the time you take is voluntary. Free will does not mean that you can free will does not mean you can establish the curriculum. It means only that you can elect what you want to take in at a given time. The course does not aim at teaching the meaning of love, for that is beyond what can be taught. It does aim, however, at removing the blocks to the awareness of love's presence, which is your natural inheritance. The opposite of love is fear, but what is all-encompassing can have no opposite. This course can therefore be summed up very simply in this way. Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. So I think, like, I'm thinking of Daryl Inga is a man who channels an entity known as Bashar. Again, the story behind that might not be something you resonate in terms of how he got into channeling, whether it is channeling, the information that Daryl Inga has brought through is, and by the way, I'll link up that Daryl's and / Bashar's YouTube channel in case you're intrigued. But my point of saying all this is what Bashar has said is that the truth feels like you already know it. Like, and that was my experience when I first read the introduction to the course. Like, you can know it's the truth that, like, once you like hear it, you're like, I didn't know that before. I could never have put those words around it, but that feels right. And that was my experience when I read this for the first time. Like, I like that it says, like, it is a required course. Like, because I think prior to reading this introduction, I think I didn't know how, I didn't really understand free will, because I had this sort of like innate understanding that, like, we do have free will, but like also shouldn't something like wiser than me be in charge? And then that's what I just love. It felt like a loving parent having boundaries for their child because they care about their safety. Like, Mother God isn't going to be like, well, I'm going to adopt the definition of love that people who like abuse their partners have. Do you know what I mean? Mother God's like, no, I have a definition of love that is love. You are welcome to have a different definition and to play out your life as long as you want with that definition and to see how that goes. And I will not judge you, and it won't change the definition of love. Like, do you feel the power in that? And so when I first read this introduction, I was like, wow, this is the first time like I could understand both of those knowings I had that I didn't know how to put together. Like, how can we have free will but not have free will? Do you know what I mean? And so I think it says this beautifully. This is A Course in Miracles. It is a required course. Only the time you take is voluntary. Free will does not mean that you can establish the curriculum. It means only you can elect what you want to take in at any given time. This course is not aimed at teaching the meaning of love, for that is beyond what can be taught. It does aim, however, at removing the blocks to the awareness of love's presence, which is your natural inheritance. So I also love that it just like establishes that like the things that are good are natural. Because I think so much of what we've tried to orchestrate in our current culture is we're like trying to cover up, like, so we haven't removed the blocks, right? But we're trying to cover it up with what is good, but then we're not actually feeling satisfied. We're not actually feeling enduring, peace. But from what I've experienced on my healing journey with A Course in Miracles being a part of that healing journey is that when I remove the blocks, that when that's my focus, then I don't have to orchestrate joy. It's just more natural that I know what to do. And by that, I mean, like, I do consciously orchestrate joy by like cutting flowers and things of that nature. But I hope you understand what I mean. It's not that like covering up of toxicity. And I think like that's when I've been over the past few weeks really curious, thinking about this idea of what is the way of the way. You know, one thing I would say has been my experience of the way is it does not cover up toxicity. You know what I mean? So you can try to cover up toxicity and you will get the experience of what it's like to have a toxic foundation with things covered up, which usually or never works out, right? Because we're not in charge of the curriculum. So the way of the way is we remove the blocks. We are guided to remove the blocks so that our foundation is strong. I mean, it like comes back to that Bible verse that you may have heard, which is like, are you building your house upon the sand or the rocks? Do you know what I mean? Like, this is saying like, you must remove the blocks so that you can build a strong foundation. And our free will lies in the time that we take. So essentially we can avoid, we can distract, we can defend as long as we want. We have that free will. And we are not judged in that. And we don't get to say, well, like, that's not like those definitions of, that's not the nature of Mother God. Like, we're not going to get the actual enduring satisfaction of living, the actual enduring inner peace, the actual enduring health and joy, if we're not in alignment with Mother God's principles, right? She's not punishing us. It's just the only principles that work. And we have free will to, like, we can, go off for lifetimes, I think, just experiencing what doesn't work. And we have that free will. And when we're ready to turn to what does work, it's important for us to realize it's about removing the blocks. It's about alchemy, which is like transforming the trauma that we've had into actual wisdom and then living from those things. And I think, as I'm speaking this out, the work of Daryl Anka / Basar really does couple well with A Course in Miracles, because in it, there's so many principles that in my mind are very cohesive and helpful. But one principle that is spoken about in that line of work is this idea that we filter everything, we filter our life force through our beliefs and definitions. That's at the root of the root of the root, is we're filtering our life force through how we define things like love and how we define things like joy and how we, right? And so if what A Course in Miracles does is help you shift those beliefs and definitions to be more in alignment with the principles of Mother God, because the principles of Mother God work. And then our life force is flowing through that which works, right? And so then we experience joy more naturally. We experience satisfaction and inner peace more naturally. And I think there's also like a freedom in this, because it's like, we don't have to come up with the curriculum. Do you know what I mean? It's more of like, oh, thank the Lord, thank Mother God. Somebody knows my path. Somebody knows the definitions. Somebody knows the beliefs that work. I just have to get out of my own way. Baby step by baby step by baby step, one step at a time. And I think that's why, one thing I really have learned, continue to learn from A Course in Miracles is the power of willingness. That willingness is actually all we really need in order to more and more get on paths that work, because there is something, again, that what you call the universe, that's what you call God, spirit, higher self, whatever you want to call it, there is something that's holding that wisdom. But it can't get in the way of our free will of that defense, right? So what is the bridge? That bridge is always willingness. And I think that has provided, and that comes back to my first story of that really big, kind of first big miracle that I experienced that was life-changing, came from the mantra from A Course in Miracles, which is, I am willing to see this differently. Do you know what I mean? That's the bridge, is our willingness. It isn't knowing. And I think I get into trouble when I think it has to be knowing, right? Like, I don't know what to do, but I need to know what to do. I just laughing at like the vicious cycles we keep ourselves stuck in. But when we know the bridge is just willingness, that Mama God has the curriculum, that this is a required course, the course is already set, and we can be like, okay, I'm willing to see this differently. I'm willing to see this differently. That really our toxicity as humans, it lies in our defenses, right? It lies in the idea of doubling down on toxicity. That's where, from what I'm witnessing, how I'm interpreting life on planet Earth and what I see as evil acts, what I've done as maladaptive acts, it doesn't come from somebody consciously being like, I'm a bad person, I want to align with malice. It's more this unconscious doubling down on what doesn't work. Defense, defense, defense. And in A Course in Miracles, one of my favorite quotes it has is, the truth needs no defense. The truth needs no defense. And so I think the bridge that is so powerful, that has been absolutely life-changing for me and continues to be, is just practicing willingness. Even if like you don't even believe it right away, but just being like, okay, this part of my life isn't working. I might have some like incoherent beliefs and definitions, right? Maybe my family wouldn't call them incoherent. Maybe my friend group wouldn't call them incoherent. Maybe my culture, subculture, religion wouldn't call it incoherent. But like, my life isn't working. This part of my life isn't working. So something must be incoherent. Maybe Mother God has a different belief and definition about this. I'm not in charge of the curriculum. I'm willing to see this differently. And I think that's like, if you've tuned into my videos before, you hear me mention a journaling exercise that I developed is on a different channel of mine, where I share more like holistic health, yoga, and Pilates stuff, where like some of my work is around like emotional health too on that channel. And I have a framework that I developed called the language of life. And I have a video on that channel that I link up to a lot in my readings. It's like a journaling exercise that's on like healing toxic shame that uses that language of life framework. And that language of life framework is intended for us to look at what is obviously uncomfortable or not working in our life, and to look at it as best we can without shame, and get more root level insights and information from it. So that we can actually move towards more balance, solve it at a more root level. And I think, a lot of that framework came from me practicing this essence, what I've learned from A Course in Miracles, which is like, Mama God is not punishing me ever. The discomforts and the things that aren't working, though, are also, so like, there's that paradox we have to hold of like, never are we being punished, but there is information about what is not working. do you know what I mean? And so if we can be like, okay, discomfort is a symptom something's not working. If something's not working, I don't need to double down on it. I don't need to defend it. I don't need to go into the rabbit hole of shame, but I can go into a practice of willingness to get information about what I might be unconsciously incorrect about. And all of us are unconsciously incorrect about so many things, right? That's not our fault. That's the culture we grew up in. That's not our fault. And it is our responsibility to correct it if we want to experience more joy, more health, more inner peace. And I think that's what kind of the essence of A Course in Miracles is all about, is like permission to be willing, and like validation or confirmation that something else knows, so we don't have to try so hard. And the bridge between like where you are now and where you want to be isn't like knowing everything. It's not like in already having it figured out. It's just willingness, 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 willingness. So I'm going to read this one more time, and then we're going to call it complete. Before I finish up by reading it, though, thank you so much for tuning in. Again, if you're at this point in the video, I really appreciate your interest in my journey with this. I've never really spoken it out in this way. And if it would be helpful, if you have other questions, again, I'm not a scholar on this or anything. But if you're interested in just my personal experience and you have other questions, I am really happy to keep talking about this powerful resource. So just drop them in the comments. And please know I appreciate you so much for tuning into this video and others. So with that, let's take a breath. And I will read this one more time and call it complete. Here we go. This is A Course in Miracles. It is a required course. Only the time you take is voluntary. Free will does not mean that you can establish the curriculum. It means only that you can elect what you want to take in at any given time. The course does not aim at teaching the meaning of love, for that is beyond what can be taught. It does aim, however, at removing the blocks to the awareness of love's presence, which is your natural inheritance. The opposite of love is fear, but what is all-encompassing can have no opposite. This course can therefore be summed up very simply in this way. Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God.